Okay, let's dig into this. This whole idea of making a place so hard to live in that people just leave.
Right, self-deportation.
Exactly. It sounds maybe kind of new, but the sources we're looking at today show it's got this really long, complicated history right here in America.
Yeah, that's right. We've got Kesu Park's article, Self-Deportation Nation, and it's fascinating because she traces this whole concept way, way back.
Before the U.S. was even the U.S.
Before the, yeah,
Yeah.
back to the colonial era.
Yeah.
And we'll see how this, indirect approach keeps popping up throughout American history.
And knowing that history is, I think, really crucial for understanding what's happening now.
Definitely.
Because we're also looking at, a pretty recent announcement from DHS, right? Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, May 5th, 2025, a press release about a new voluntary self-deportation program.
And it includes money, a stipend.
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
A stipend to leave.
Okay, and then there's another piece to this puzzle.
Right, the American Immigration Council. They put out a report looking at the other side, the potential costs of, mass deportation. It's a very different picture.
Very different. So our mission for this deep dive, connect those dots. Look at the history of self-deportation, check out this new DHS thing, and then weigh it all against what the AIC report says about the costs and, the ripple effects of big deportation pushes.
Sounds good. Where do you want to start? History.
Yeah, let's start there. With Park's article, you said it goes back before the U.S. colonial times.
Absolutely. Park argues that for the colonists, self-deportation was like a key tool against Native Americans.
Now so.
Well, instead of just direct conflict, though, that happened too, they focused on creating conditions, pushing people off hunting grounds, disrupting agriculture, making life basically impossible.
So they'd leave voluntarily.
Exactly. Clearing the land was, step one for settlement.
Mm-hmm.
And making life unsustainable was a way to achieve that.
Wow. So that basic idea, make a place unlivable for a group you want, gone, was there from the very start.
Right. And Park shows how the new nation kind of picked up that playbook for Indian removal.
It wasn't just treaties and forced marches.
No, it was also about applying pressure.
Yeah.
Creating those conditions that made staying untenable before the forced removal often happened.
Okay. And then later, freed slaves. That came up too.
It did. There were debates, after abolition. Direct deportation was on the table, sure, but so is this idea of making conditions so bad that Black people would choose to leave.
And Park says this continued even after that. States and cities getting involved.
Yeah, post-abolition, states and municipalities started using similar tactics, often targeting Black communities and also Chinese immigrants.
Okay, but Park points out a shift here, right?
Right.
What was the main goal then?
That's a really key point she makes. Earlier, with colonists and Indian removal, it was mostly about getting the land.
Right.
After abolition, the focus kind of shifts more towards controlling labor.
How does that work?
By making it really hard to actually live there, restricting jobs, housing, basic services. The idea was to make these communities unstable, basically pushing people out indirectly.
So it moved from controlling the ground under their feet to controlling their ability to even exist there.
Exactly. It's still about removal, but the mechanism changes. Subordination, making life precarious, becomes the tool.
That makes sense. Then we get into the 20th century, and the federal government starts building up its own deportation system. How did that connect with this older idea?
Well, as the feds got more power to deport people directly, for more reasons, the threat of that direct deportation became in itself a powerful modern kind of self-deportation.
Just the fear of it.
Yeah. Park estimates that threat hangs over something like 22 million unauthorized people today. It creates this constant background hum of anxiety and pressure.
22 million. That's huge. And Park also talks about this cycle with state and local efforts, right?
Yeah, she points out this recurring pattern. States or cities try to pass laws to make life difficult, encourage self-deportation.
Like Arizona's SB 1070, maybe. Things like
that, yeah. But then the courts often step in and say, nope, immigration is federal.
They strike them down.
Right. And then, Park argues, the federal government often responds by actually strengthening its own direct deportation powers.
Huh. So state tries, gets blocked. Feds step up their own enforcement, like a feedback loop.
Sort of, yeah. It highlights this ongoing tension, but also the consistent federal dominance in this area.
And Park's core argument really emphasizes this idea of subordination.
Yes. Her main point is that making life difficult, creating these subordinating conditions, has historically been the primary way the U.S. has regulated migration.
Not direct deportation.
Direct deportation is important, she says, but it often acts as a backup or maybe a consequence of this wider system designed to make certain groups precarious. Subordination first, direct deportation as a supplement.
And she connects this whole history directly to today, to inequality.
Absolutely. She argues this long history is a major reason why we have the unequal distributions of power, wealth, and property along racial lines that we see today.
So understanding this history is crucial to understanding current immigration debates.
Definitely. You can't really grasp the present without seeing these long historical roots.
Okay, that's a really helpful, if sobering, historical context. Let's shift now to the present day, or very near present, this DHS announcement, May 5th, 2025. What's the headline?
The headline is basically, DHS is offering travel help and a $1,000 stipend for undocumented immigrants who agree to self-deport using a government app.
An app. The CBP Home App, it says here.
Right. You use the app, signal you're leaving, and once they confirm you've actually returned to your home country, you get the $1,000.
Okay. And there's a quote here from Secretary Noem. What's the official justification?
Secretary Noem calls it the best, safest, and most cost-effective way to leave the United States to avoid arrest.
Cost-effective is highlighted.
Very much so. They claim it's 70% cheaper than arresting, detaining, and formally removing someone. They cite a figure, I think, from Newsweek of over $17,000 for a formal removal.
$17,000 versus $1,000 plus some travel assistance. Big difference if those numbers hold up.
That's the argument, yeah. Safer, cheaper. She explicitly encourages people to download the app and use this option.
So how does it work logistically? You sign up on the app.
Right. You indicate you intend to self-deport. DHS claims if you do that and you're genuinely making moves to leave, you'll be put in a lower priority group for detention or removal while you're arranging your departure.
Okay. And what about coming back legally later? Does this help or hurt?
That's where it gets tricky. The press release says participation may help preserve the option for future legal reentry.
May help preserve. That sounds a bit vague.
It is. And some experts, like Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, who tracks these things, are really sounding the alarm here.
Why? What's the risk?
They warn that this idea of preserving future options is often, well, misleading or even false. Depending on the exact legal authority used, like this specific law, 8 U.S.C. Section 1260, participating could actually bar you from legally returning for many years, maybe even permanently.
So it could backfire badly.
It really good. It might even mess up any ongoing immigration case someone has.
Yeah.
So what looks like a helping hand could end up being a trap with long-term consequences.
Wow. That's a critical warning. Okay, so we have the history. We have this new program pushing voluntary departure with the cash incentive. Now let's look at the flip side. What if the approach was mass deportation? Our next source, the American Immigration Council report, digs into the costs. What's the big takeaway number?
The AIC report hammers home the massive costs. Their baseline, conservative estimate for a one-time operation to remove the roughly 11 million undocumented people here in 2022.
Yeah.
At least $315 billion.
Billion, just for one operation.
$315 billion. And they stress that's conservative.
What does that number not include? That's almost unbelievable.
Right. It doesn't include the longer-term costs of maintaining such an effort, or what they call the incalculable cost of just building the capacity to detain and process that many people over 13 million, they estimate would need detention at some point.
13 million? Compared to what?
Compared to the entire U.S. prison and jail population in 2022, which was under 2 million. You're talking about detaining many times more people than are currently incarcerated for everything else.
Yeah.
The scale is just immense.
Unprecedented. Okay, what about a more sustained effort, like, say, aiming for 1 million deportations a year?
Even that, which assumes maybe 20% might self-deport under pressure, would cost an estimated $88 billion per year.
Every year?
Every single year.
Yeah.
Over a decade, that's nearly $1 trillion, $968 billion. And that requires a huge permanent expansion of the system, 24 times the current ICE detention capacity, over 1,000 new immigration courtrooms.
$88 billion a year. That's hard to even wrap your head around. Does the report compare that to anything?
It does. And the comparisons are stark. $88 billion is almost double the entire NIH budget, all medical research.
Wow.
It's nearly 4 times NASA's budget, almost 3 times what the federal government spends on school lunches and child nutrition. Way more than the child tax credit.
So massive trade-offs and priorities.
Huge trade-offs. It's also about 18 times the total global spending on cancer research each year. It really puts the sheer scale of the cost into perspective.
Absolutely. But it's not just government spending, right? The report talks about the hit to the wider economy.
Oh, definitely. AIC estimates mass deportation would shrink the U.S. GDP by somewhere between 4.2 and 6.8%.
Why such a big hit?
Largely because you're removing millions of workers from the economy. Plus, you lose all the taxes they pay. In 2022, they estimated undocumented households paid nearly $47 billion in federal taxes, over $29 billion in state and local.
And Social Security, Medicare.
Significant contributions there, too. Over $22 billion to Social Security, nearly $6 billion to Medicare in 2022 alone. That revenue just disappears.
Which industries would be hit hardest by losing workers?
The report points to sectors like construction, where nearly 14% of workers are estimated to be undocumented.
14%.
Yeah. Agriculture, hospitality, big impacts there too. And it wouldn't just be those jobs. The disruption could lead to hundreds of thousands of U.S.-born workers losing their jobs as industries contract or get thrown into chaos.
And then there's the human cost, beyond the economics.
Which is immense. They estimate about 4 million mixed-status families would be torn apart. That includes over 5 million U.S. citizen kids.
5 million children.
Yeah. U.S. citizens separated from parents. The emotional trauma is obvious, but also huge economic hardship for those families. They project an average income drop of almost 63% for those households.
63%.
Devastating.
And they also raise concerns about, the social climate, potential for more vigilantism, hate crimes.
Does the report break down the costs per person for that 1 million a year scenario? It does give some averages. About $7 billion just for arrests each year, $66 billion for detention and alternatives, $12.6 billion for legal processing through the courts, and $2.1 billion for the actual physical removal.
And you'd need more enforcement officers?
A lot more. Over 30,000 new ICE agents and staff just to handle 1 million arrests annually.
The report also makes a point about the demographics, right? The workforce participation.
Yes, that's important. Nearly 90% of undocumented immigrants were working age in 2022. That's much higher than the U.S.-born population, which was around 61%.
So removing them hits the workforce particularly hard.
Exactly. It would make existing labor shortages much worse. Plus, you lose entrepreneurs. They counted about 1 million undocumented entrepreneurs in 2022.
Really? Running their own businesses?
Yeah. Generating over $27 billion in business income, many running local neighborhood businesses, employing people.
And again, the lost contributions to Social Security and Medicare.
Right. That $22.6 billion for Social Security, $5.7 billion for Medicare, gone, adding more strain to those systems down the road.
So the total estimated GDP loss?
Between $1.1 trillion and $1.7 trillion.
Yeah.
In 2022 dollars over time. Huge impact. Especially hard hit would be states like California, Texas, Florida.
And these aren't mostly recent arrivals, are they?
No, the report notes the majority have been in the U.S. for a decade or more. They have deep roots. Nearly 40% even owned homes in 2022.
Wow. Homeowners. Did the report factor in self-deportation for its big cost numbers?
It acknowledges that maybe 20% might self-deport under intense pressure in that million-a-year scenario. But the big $315 billion number for a one-time mass operation, that doesn't really count for it, mainly because it's so hard to predict how many would leave voluntarily or when.
Okay. So the AIC report paints this picture of just staggering costs, financial, economic, human, for mass deportation. A really stark contrast to the DHS program focused on saving money through voluntary departure.
Absolutely. Two very different visions of enforcement and its consequences.
Now, let's zoom out slightly and touch on the politics. We know immigration is always a huge issue, especially around elections. We have some notes comparing Trump and Harris's general stances. What are the main divergences?
Well, looking back at Trump's first term and his stated plans, the focus was heavily on restricting immigration overall, both legal and illegal. Things like limiting asylum, cutting refugee numbers, the border wall.
Right.
Harris, as VP, has often emphasized addressing the root causes of migration, particularly from Central America, using aid and diplomacy.
And the language they use is very different, too.
Very different. Trump has used rhetoric that many find inflammatory, like the poisoning the blood comment.
Yeah, that got a lot of attention.
Which critics link to racist or anti-Semitic tropes. Harris tends to frame immigrants as contributors to the country, condemning Trump's language.
What about border security specifically?
Trump promises a hard line, shut down the border, bring back Title 42, keep building the wall.
And Harris, the Biden-Harris administration?
Well, Harris opposed the wall initially, but the administration did close some gaps and plan more construction. And importantly, they implemented that June 2024 executive action allowing border shutdowns based on encounter numbers. So some overlap in seeking tighter border control, but different methods and rhetoric.
Asylum is another big one.
Huge difference there, at least in stated goals. Trump pushed remain in Mexico, family separations, tried to narrow asylum eligibility drastically.
The Biden-Harris administration reversed those initially.
They ended remain in Mexico and family separations, yes. But they've also put in place their own restrictive asylum rules, the Circumvention of Lawful Pathways rule, and that June 2024 rule, which significantly curtails asylum access when border crossings are high. So it's complex.
And on deportations, we talked about the AIC report's view on mass deportation costs. What are the candidates actually proposing?
Trump explicitly talks about mass deportations, using expedited removal more, workplace raids, potentially large detention camps, even referencing things like Operation Wetback from the 1950s.
Wow, and the Biden-Harris approach.
They focus more on pushing for legislation for a pathway to citizenship for those already here, and some executive actions like parole in place to help keep families together, specifically spouses of citizens. Very different directions.
Birthright citizenship, another clear difference.
Very clear. Trump wants to end it, challenge the 14th Amendment. Harris strongly defends it.
What about DACA recipients, the Dreamers?
Trump tried to end DACA, suggests they be included in deportations. Harris and the current administration support protecting Dreamers, trying to expand things like healthcare access for them.
Okay, and finally, legal immigration and refugees.
Trump aimed to cut legal immigration levels. Harris argues legal immigrants strengthen the country, and the administration took steps to reopen some legal channels. Though, interestingly, Trump recently floated giving green cards to foreign graduates of U.S. colleges.
A potential shift there.
Maybe. On refugees, Trump drastically cut admissions, wants to suspend resettlement, revoke things like TPS. The Biden-Harris administration has worked to rebuild the refugee program and maintained humanitarian protections like TPS for various groups.
So, yeah, pretty fundamental disagreements across the board on immigration policy and philosophy.
Definitely. Very different visions.
And just one last point to bring it back to the DHS program, this idea of paying people to leave isn't entirely brand new, is it?
No, actually. An old AP News article mentions that Trump himself, at one point, had floated the idea of paying undocumented immigrants $1,000 to leave voluntarily.
Huh. So the idea has been around.
The idea's been floated before, yeah. But that same article also pointed to studies suggesting these kinds of voluntary return programs generally haven't been very effective at getting large numbers of people to go home permanently. Their long-term success is often questioned.
Right, whether people just try to come back later.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground. We've looked at this really long, deep history of self-deportation as a concept in America.
Yeah, how making life difficult has been a tool for removal for centuries.
Then we looked at the current DHS program trying to incentivize voluntary departure with cash.
And the warnings about potential hidden consequences, especially for future legal options.
Contrasted with the massive, almost mind-boggling costs, financial, economic, and human laid out in the American Immigration Council report if the U.S. were to pursue mass deportation.
Yeah, the sheer scale and impact detailed there is pretty sobering.
All against the backdrop of these really different political approaches we just touched on.
It really highlights the tension, doesn't it, between these different ways of thinking about immigration enforcement.
It really does. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it leaves us, and you, the listener, some big questions, I think. Given the history, the current policies, the potential costs, what are the most effective, the most, responsible ways to manage immigration, especially in a country literally built by immigrants over centuries?
And maybe, what are these very different paths? Subordination, incentivized departure, mass removal.
Yeah.
What do they signal about, the country's values? The kind of future we're actually building.
Yeah. What does it all say about us? Definitely a lot to think about.